Hi, Encounter. Good morning. Welcome to our daily devotional. Yesterday, I was actually out of town over the weekend and we're traveling, so we have a chance to put one of these out for Monday. But today is our first daily devotional of the week. What I'd like to do during this videos is to go over the sermon from Sunday and maybe like elaborate on a couple things that I get a chance to talk about. And what I want to talk about today is one thing that I wish I could have maybe explained better during the sermon is, I was talking about singing and about worship interchangeably. And maybe you're listening to that, and maybe you're not a singing person, or maybe you're just kind of like, a Bible person. You're like, well, actually, they're not necessarily the same. And I agree with you 100%. And the reason why I use them interchangeably was because the passage that we're looking at is about, Paul and Silas singing to God. Like that's what's going on in the passage, and that's where we get that from. But with that said, I would like to kind of like expand the idea of worship beyond just singing. And the one passage that always comes to my mind is the story in the Gospel of John. You probably know that as a story of the woman at the well, the story of the Samaritan woman. Jesus comes across a Samaritan woman and they have a conversation, and kind of like at the end of the conversation, this woman like comes to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But in the middle of the conversation, she brings something up. She says like, well, you talking about people from Judea, said you Jews worship God in Jerusalem at the temple, and then he says like, but our ancestors have been worshiping God at Mount Gerizim, like this other mount, and there's a lot of historical facts going on, but basically, the Samaritans were there when there was no temple. Like they had been there for hundreds of years while the people of Israel were in exile, and they basically developed their own system of worship and the whole deal at this mountain. Then when the Jewish people came back, they never really got along. There was actually very strong ethnic tension, so they were worshiping at this separate place. And that's what Jesus is asking about. And Jesus answers the question and tells her the temple is the place that God has appointed, but it comes a day where that's not going to matter anymore. But then Jesus says this. This is just John chapter 4, and I'm going to just read verse 23. It says, "Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." God is Spirit, and His worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. And what I find fascinating about that story is that they're having this conversation about method, right? About technique. Like it says, do we have to worship in this place or in this place? Maybe the conversation for us is about forms of worship, right? Should we worship by singing, or are there other ways in which we can worship? Maybe you don't like music that much and you don't connect with God that way. And maybe for you is contemplating or meditating or being in silence or getting out in nature. Maybe you're a painter. For you, like you paint sometimes, and that's worship. I have a friend that he had it was very difficult for him to like just pray to God, but he was a musician, so he would just play guitar for God, and that was his worship. And there's all these different ways, and a lot of times we get both. We kind of like get like stuck on conversation of technique. Maybe you come from a different Christian tradition in which worship has to happen in a very particular way, right? Like you have a whole liturgy around how you worship God. Maybe I don't know, like maybe you grew up kind of like in a more old-fashioned church that we have to sing hymns, right? And hymns are the way in which we worship God. There's all sorts of different ways in which this can be applied. Like maybe I don't know, like I grew up in the Pentecostal church where worship was supposed to be spontaneous. It was supposed to be very extravagant. We would sing, dance, clap, like people would speak in tongues. So this very boisterous form of worship, and it felt like if it wasn't like that, it wasn't genuine. And we have all these conversations about that, and Jesus here comes to this point about having this conversation about how what's a proper technique for worship. And Jesus says, look, this is a technique, like in the case of the Samaritan woman, she says that, well, actually, God appointed the temple as a place to worship. There's a specific technique if you want it, but then he says, but there comes a day, and my understanding of that passage is that day is after the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is pointing to the age of the church, and he says, where God's not going to care about that as much as He's going to care about whether we're doing this in spirit and in truth. And the reason why we're using singing was because that was what the passage was about. But what I wanted to get to was a deeper idea beyond just singing, and it's the idea of doing something for God's sake. A lot of times prayer is not for God's sake, but for our sake. We have this problem, we have this thing, and we come to God in order to, ask God to help us in this need. And that's important. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm not saying there's not a place for that. A lot of times we read the Bible because we're trying to get some sort of information. We're trying to grow. Like there is, even in that sense, a lot of times there's a level of self-interest in why we do something. But worship, true worship in spirit and in truth it's none of that. Worship is just this response to the majesty and awesomeness of God. And we can't help but express it somehow. And maybe in some settings that's singing, and maybe in some settings that's some other form of worship. Maybe it is prayers. Maybe it is just, sitting down in silence because we're so overwhelmed by who God is. Maybe it's being on our knees in prayer. Maybe you come from a tradition that's much more structured and liturgical. And for you, you find a way to truly worship God in the midst of that. And the prayers that you repeat, maybe you use prayer beads or the rosary. And maybe you have like specific prayers that you recite. And you do them not because of you, but you do it because of God. When we're doing something for the sake of God, that's true worship. And what I was trying to get at is this idea that one of the evidences of the proofs of that we've come to find shelter in God, that we've come to the place where we know that we're under God's protection and provision. Well, the natural response to that is worship. The natural response to that is just to just, get out of ourselves for a second and just focus on God because of how good He is, because of how powerful He is, because of how, how much He's shown Himself in our lives, and we can't help but worship. So don't limit yourself to thinking about worship in terms of just singing. For me, singing works, right? And there's other forms in which in every one's of our spiritual journeys, there are different things that work in different ways, and that's fine. But I think that what I would encourage you, what I encourage myself, a lot of this passage, am I doing this in spirit and in truth? Is this something real? Or am I just going through the motions? And you can go through the motions in liturgical settings, and you can go through the motions in Pentecostal settings. I grew up in the Pentecostal church. I remember many times I was completely checked out and just singing along. And I've been in liturgical settings where we're so incredibly powerful and just filled with God's presence that I was moved to tears. And vice versa. So it's not as much about the singing. It's about the Spirit, but also about the truth. Am I doing this for my sake, or am I doing this for God's sake? And maybe this week we can think about that. How am I worshiping in spirit and in truth? So I want you to pray with me today. Dear God, we truly want to be real worshipers. People that worship in spirit and truth. People are not just going through the motions or just doing this because that's what we've always done. But people that are, responding to the reality of you in the only possible way that we can, which is to worship you. We want to be people that do this not motivated for some sort of self-interest, not just because we want you to answer a prayer or because we want to get something from you, but just because of you. Motivated by you, moved by you. So God, Father, my prayer this morning, my prayer for my brothers and sisters watching this, my prayer for our church this weekend, is that we would get to worship you in spirit and truth. Thank you, Lord. Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow. Grace and peace.